Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Ruby Ziegler. I am the chair of the Oxford European Association and of New Europeans Association, UK. And I'm delighted to be chairing this fourth panel of Oxford for Europe, the main grassroots organization that has organized this debate. We've had a discussion in January 2017, just before the Withdrawal Act or the notification of Withdrawal Act rather was passed in the Commons, then one in December 2017, just after the draft withdrawal agreement was passed, and in April we discussed the impact of Brexit on a series of different areas of our lives, and today we've decided to focus specifically on the impact of Brexit on business and to bring to the fore, for that purpose, business people from different and varied areas of life, and indeed not just business but the arts as well. The other organisation that co-sponsors this event and has kindly sponsored the room is the Oxford European Association. Having said that, and you won't be surprised to hear me say this event is not cost-free. Neither is the voluntary work and time that the many people who work for Oxford European Association, the Oxford for Europe, are putting in, and so please be generous. At the end, there will be buckets waiting for you. The hashtag for this event, if you are using Twitter, will be in one word, Oxford Business Brexit. So please do use that as well. And the format for today will be as follows. We will start by hearing from 6 business people and from a business analyst looking at different areas of life, as I said, that are affected by Brexit. We will then hear from Annelies Dodds MP and from Councillor Liz Lefman, have their responses to what they've heard from the business people, and then open it up for certain contributions from you, the audience. Secondly, we'll then turn around, as you were, to the politics of Brexit, and we'll ask politicians, also Oxford City Councillors that we have with us, Councillor Craig Simmons, Councillor Steph Garden, I think Tiago Correis, if he will arrive by then, to join us here and talk about where we go from here and what we do next. And then finally, we want to enter into activism mode and talk about the People's Vote campaign, talk about the march on the 20th of October, and see how we mobilize to make an effort. And this is a non-political, non-party political, I should say, event, but it's not a non-partisan event in the sense that we clearly do believe, as the science suggests here, that Brexit is a particularly bad idea that ought to be stopped, and this is certainly the aim of Oxford for Europe since its inception. Without further ado, we have, as I said, 7 speakers here. I'm going to introduce them in turn, and I'll ask them to speak. I'll be fairly rigid with not red lines, but red cards. So I've got a yellow and a red card to indicate when their time is running. Our first speaker is Professor Andrew Harrison, who's the CEO of Diamond Light Source. And if I can ask you to kick us off.
Certainly, a pleasure. Can you all hear me? Yes. So yes, I'm Andrew Harrison. I'm the CEO of Diamond Light Source. Some of you may know us. Some of you may even have visited us. So if you take the A34 south of here, past the Milton Roundabout near Didcot, it's that big silver building about the size of Wembley Stadium. Under that roof, we produce brilliant light that is 10 billion times brighter than the sun, and that light feeds a set of microscopes with which people can look at materials in the most exquisite detail. And that sort of facility is bigger than any individual university can own, so it's a national facility. We support about 10,000 scientists every year from universities and industry. We have about 120 companies who pay for access to our facility because it's crucial to their R&D. So locally, for example, we have Infinium just down the road from us who make fuel additives. We have Milton Park packed full of high-tech companies for whom we are a crucial part of their R&D program. And I also have about 650 staff. So impressive though the machine is, the crucial ingredient for us is to be able to employ some of the most talented and highly experienced people in areas with very rare skills. Now I'm going to digress a little bit. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my own journey here because I think it's very relevant for this. So I was born down the road at the old John Radcliffe. I'm a local boy, although my accent doesn't sound like it anymore because I've been away a lot. I was a student here. I did my doctorate here, and then I went out into the world and I was a professor of chemistry for a while. And in the course of my research for 20 years or so, I would travel the world and I would use facilities like Diamond as a core part of my research in Canada, in the US, in Japan, and throughout Europe. And then in 2006, I had the opportunity to become director of a facility that the UK co-owns in our twin town of Grenoble, so a research facility in Grenoble. And one reason why I leapt at the chance was not just because it was an interesting new job, but because I could take my entire family with me. They knew that they could settle in another country without any impediment. My wife would have the right when she arrived to go and get a job. I would not have made that transition to the United States, for example, and anticipated the challenges that she would have had to continue in her own career. So from my perspective, it was absolutely crucial that I could take that step. And then in 2014, I was fortunate to get this particular post, and I travelled back. One incentive was so that my children could grow up as native English speakers, and I just note in passing that we contributed +5 to the immigration statistics that year. It was there was more, I suppose, more anxiety about immigration statistics in 2014 compared to 2006, but nevertheless we were one of those people who entered this country again and made our homes here again. And coming back to Diamond and why our association with Europe in its current form is so important to us, I'll just make 3 brief points. First of all, science by its nature is a highly cooperative business. A large proportion of the science that we support is done in collaboration. Well, it's done by people, very bright people coming from universities, increasingly in large multinational teams, and often that is supported by funds from the European Commission. So first of all, one of the challenges that we would face after a Brexit that made it harder to remain part of that community is to try to re-establish the ties, try to re-establish the networks on which an awful lot of the science that we deliver is founded. Secondly, facilities like Diamond rely on cutting-edge technology. I mean, you imagine a mobile phone in your pocket. Very few of you, I imagine, have got a 10-year-old phone. I think you're used to replacing the technology in your pocket or the technology in your everyday life every few years, and Diamond is just like that. We have to remain at the technological edge to be competitive and give the UK science community the best possible opportunities to continue to do cutting-edge science. And our future plans at the moment and for the last few years have depended on collaborative networks across Europe to develop the next generation technology. These also require very rare skills that are generally not concentrated in any one country. And again, you could say, why not go global? Well, we have spent decades building up highly intricate networks and understanding where our key complementary strengths lie. And to have that become much more difficult would be very, very disruptive. And of course, you know, in principle, we can go and forge new links with other countries, but there would certainly be a long break before we got back to the position we're in. Thirdly, and this is really the crucial thing, and it comes back to my own story, is the thing on which we most depend is highly skilled scientists, engineers, and technicians. And we're already starting to see people leaving, telling me to my face, the reason I have left is because I don't feel the UK is a country I want to stay in anymore with me and my family. And that isn't just, actually, paradoxically, the first person to leave Diamond who cited Brexit or impending Brexit as the reason was a UK national. We also have found it harder to attract people. And I remember going to Sweden recently, and a number of my colleagues in Sweden saying, Andrew, Brexit's wonderful for us. We've seen a real surge in applications of UK-based scientists for jobs in this case, Sweden, but I'm sure that pattern is reproduced elsewhere. So attracting and retaining people is already becoming harder for us. And I'd say the reverse process is important too. So a large fraction of my UK scientists have cut their teeth, have got their experience, like I did, by travelling abroad and working in those other facilities. Now again, that can be done internationally, but it's much easier, and the density of facilities in which one can do that, to be able to cross relatively close borders, relocate. You know, I could jump on a train in Oxford and I could be in Brussels in 4 hours, and I can work for 3 hours of that on the train, provided I can actually work on the train between here and Paddington. But the point is, these are all places that are very, very easy to get to, and the proximity, even in this globally connected world, also makes a difference. You know, we all have more extended families. I have aging parents, and we don't necessarily want to go and relocate to China and Japan and the United States when we seek to be part of that global community. So for us, I think actually the key thing is to continue to ensure that the UK offers a welcoming home for those scientists, engineers and technicians on which our future strengths, at least in Diamond, will rest. Thank you.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Andrew. And I'll turn to Alia Cornish, who is a viola player, and she works for the renowned Baroque ensemble Instruments of Time and Truth. And she'll talk to us about how it feels to be a musician at this time.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me all right on this microphone? Shall I stand up? Yeah, sure. Oh. Is that better? Yes. Great. Okay, hello. So my name's Alia. I'm a freelance viola player as well as working for Oxford's Period Instrument Orchestra, Instruments of Time and Truth, where I'm the administrator as well as playing for the ensemble. At the last night of the proms this year, the conductor laureate of the BBC SO, Sir Andrew Davis, turned to talk to the audience. Some of you may have watched it and listened to it. There were 6,000 people in the Albert Hall that night and countless thousands listening around the world. He said, I won't tell you all of it because it was quite long, music is not mere entertainment, but rather one of the most powerful forces for good that we have. It has the power to unite us in beauty and in strength. Sir Andrew's words will ring true for anyone who loves classical music. What many don't realise is that music is hugely beneficial for our economy in the UK. The music industry itself generates £4.4 billion of revenue for our economy every year, and £2.5 billion of that is export revenue from touring activity in the EU. Those figures are quite staggering, really, when you think about it. In a recent poll by the Incorporated Society of Musicians, a third of polled musicians said that 50% or more of their income comes from engagements in the EU. As it stands at the moment, if we go to work in the EU, it's quite simple. And as a result of that, sometimes you can be asked really quite late to jump in on a project. You might get an email from a group in France saying, we need someone in 4 days in Paris, can you come? Well, the answer is, if I have my tax form from HMRC saying that I'm a UK taxpayer, I can just jump on a train or a plane with an instrument. I go, and because of the tax form, the French tax people will not deduct their tax from my fee. I'm paid, and I pay tax on it in the UK. So it's a really simple system. By contrast, I went to America on tour last year, and for that I got a work visa, which was, as you probably know, those of you that have done it, it's not an impossible process, but a little tricky. And then I had to get a passport for my instrument, which was the most bizarre thing. So I took my viola to Oxford Violins, and said, I have to have a passport. I don't know what I need to do. And they said, we don't know what you need to do either. Let's look at it together. And they put together a list of items that they were pretty sure were in my viola. You run into some really funny things, like there are 2 almost identical kinds of rosewood, one of which is perfectly fine to take into the US, one of which, if they think it's in your instrument, they can destroy it on the spot. So it was quite a daunting prospect to get that paperwork together, but I managed it, and my instrument was not destroyed on the spot when I landed in Chicago. It was all fine. Now, of course, it's very unlikely that that sort of measure is going to come into play overnight when we leave the EU. But of course, no one's really sure of anything at the moment, and that is just one example of the sort of bureaucracy that can spring up when you lose a common rule book. For UK ensembles wanting to travel to the EU, there's a cost involved with getting together all the paperwork that you need. If an ensemble applies for work visas for all of its musicians or singers, suddenly you've got to have an administrator doing that. You have to pay for the visas, you have to pay the person who's doing that job. Presumably, you then have to add that onto your fee for a UK promoter. So I wonder, suddenly a festival in Spain that wants to book Instruments of Time and Truth might decide in a couple of years' time, well, actually, there's a group in France that doesn't need to get the visas, so maybe we'll just put them. Makes sense, really. Also, would an orchestra in Paris still want me if they have to process my paperwork? It's quite a scary prospect, but actually some orchestras, I've heard in Germany that there are friends of mine in the UK who had work offered to them with German orchestras. That's now been retracted because those orchestras are uncertain about what's going to happen, as are we all. So already the uncertainty really is bad for business. 2 training opportunities have already been lost to Brexit in the UK. The European Union Youth Orchestra and the European Union Baroque Orchestra, which some of you may know because their headquarters were in Woodstock for 30 years, in fact. Nothing like those training schemes is actually available in the UK. I say that as someone who was a member of the European Union Baroque Orchestra for 2 years. It shaped my path into the profession, and it marked me out when I graduated as somebody who had that level of experience that just gave me an edge on other people. It makes me really sad to think that our musicians coming out of music college aren't going to get those chances anymore. The other issue, of course, in terms of education, is will music colleges start charging non-UK EU nationals the £23,000 a year that they currently charge non-home students? If so, how many will miss out? Additionally, of course, how many music college professors earn enough to count as one of Theresa May's highly skilled workers? Extrapolating from what we know so far about Brexit, it paints a pretty grim picture going forward for the next generation of classical musicians. As I mentioned already, I work as the administrator for Instruments of Time and Truth. In an extraordinary move, we didn't plan this date, I should say that now. We leave the UK to tour to Spain on March the 29th next year. I'll say it again, we didn't choose the date. We currently have no idea of what we need to prepare. We're taking a group of about 45 musicians to Spain for a week. We don't know if we have to get work visas, instrument passports. We're just waiting to see. It's not a great feeling. We'd like to know, ideally. So, Paul McCreesh, the artistic director of the Gabrielli Consort and Players, sums up the situation for musicians as follows. Let's be realistic. Leaving the EU is not going to prevent the Berlin Philharmonic from appearing at the proms, nor will opera houses in Vienna, Paris or Madrid cease to engage the most renowned soloists. But the axe will fall very hard on thousands of hard-working UK-based musicians who are likely to face drastic loss of earnings. With 176 days until we leave the EU, the Musicians' Union is lobbying for multi-entry visas for the creative industries to try and soften the blow. The reality in our area of industry, as with so many, as we already heard in fact, is that the uncertainty is bad for business and it's already having an impact. To keep the UK as a thriving centre for classical music, it is really essential that we retain freedom of movement post-Brexit. Festivals such as the BBC Proms and the Edinburgh Festival offer an amazing platform for classical music across the world. As UK musicians, we do not want to lose our place on this stage. Thank you.
So our next speaker is Dr. John Boyle, who is the founder and managing director of Oxford Computer Consultants. So, John.
Yes, thank you. Good evening, everyone. I had planned to stand up because I wanted you to see how worried I am as well as to hear it. So I thought those of you at the back would be able to see that as well. So I'm the managing director of Oxford Computer Consultants, an IT company. I'm also the chairman of something called the Oxford Trust. We support about 40 of the region's most important and high-growth companies in innovation, research and development. So I represent their voice as well as that for my own company. And I want to talk about the impact that Brexit is already having. People say Brexit will do this and will do that, but actually we fail to realise quite how much of an impact it's already had on business. And I'm going to talk about four main areas: recruitment and retention, which Andrew's already mentioned, research and development, costs and legislation. So in recruitment and retention, we already have a huge problem. The IT industry is a hugely competitive and global industry. There are shortages of professionals throughout Europe, and we are competing on a scale with all the other countries in Europe. We have suddenly become far less attractive to people to come here. We become less attractive because they're unsure about their status. But we've also become unattractive because of what's happened to the pound. People talk about the economy, that GDP hasn't shifted, that the prices of houses has risen. Look, the country's for sale. It's 20% cheaper than it was 18 months ago. The whole place has just gone on a big discount, and so people from other countries who think of coming here and who think they might want one day to go back to their countries, effectively have taken a 20% pay cut. So we've had to compensate that. We've seen a huge rise in our costs and in our labour costs. It's the only way we can keep key people. And what does that mean? It means we have to pass on a lot of those costs to our clients. And a lot of our clients are in the health and social care space. So that means their administration and infrastructure costs have risen. So when people tell you that there will be more money for health and social care as a result of Brexit, that's not true. There will be less money as costs rise across the board because of the costs of getting the skilled people and the people to come to this country. They will just need to be paid more. So it's a huge problem. And then there's also the psychological problem. I spend a lot of time in France and Germany with clients, and people just feel bad about Britain. You know, they just don't think we're welcoming. And I have first-hand experience of this. My wife is French, 28 years she's been in Britain. And we're going through a horrendous process. There's a 3-stage process that she's got to go through. Registration, a document that was so intrusive, asking for copies of child benefits and everything we've had. We finally got through that. Now she's got to do the Knowledge of Britain test after 28 years. And I'll tell you what, it's not easy. So here's one of the questions. What is the minimum age to become an MP in Britain? Anybody want to shout out the answer? Okay, turns out there is no minimum age, right? Which does explain a few things, doesn't it? Quite. So there we are. However, she has learned that Geoffrey Boycott was a cricketer, and for that I am at least grateful for the process. And when we're through that stage, then she has to apply to become a British citizen. Again, another form containing mainly the same information, but including an £800 cheque that the government would like to receive from my wife, who's been here for 28 years, supporting me to grow and run my business. It's outrageous. And she's not one example. The country and Oxfordshire is full of these people. So people have mobility, and if they're looking for mobility, Britain will no longer be a major choice for these people, and the costs and the scarcity of resources will become worse. Then research and development. Now look, I've been doing research work in Europe for many years, and actually I'm not a huge fan of how it worked, and I thought it was very inefficient. And the problem is that as we leave Europe, it's very unclear whether there's going to be a replacement. If there was good research that was supported at national level with connections into Europe, that could work. But actually we've been left in complete limbo. We do not know what's going to happen to our research funding going forwards. And as a result of which, all the European partners and contacts we've built up said, we don't know, you might be in the programme, you might not. But in the meantime, we won't involve you in any of our projects. So we've had an 18-month gap where we haven't had an opportunity to get involved in new research projects. It's a huge dent in our innovation and our capacity to grow and build opportunities in Oxfordshire. And then costs. This fall in the pound rarely gets mentioned. I guess because a lot of the people who voted for Brexit don't perhaps go abroad a lot. But actually, if you're dealing with Europe, we're dealing with European employees, dealing with the costs of Europe, as I said, we're 20% more expensive or cheaper, whichever way you look at it, than we were. So all the infrastructure, all the software, everything we need to buy in from any part of the world has gone up in costs, and we're having to pass that on to our customers. So it's a real dent on what we can do for business and for the markets. And then there are things like legislation, again, not very politically talked about, but there are small examples. So for example, a lot of our business opportunities are run on these websites that have .eu domain names. Now, that may not mean much to some of you, but actually we're probably going to lose the right to use those. So we're going to have to rebrand and repurpose a lot of the business tools that we use in order to get back to where we started from. A huge waste of time and money that will set us back further. So what should happen next? Well, look, we're here because we believe that there needs to be another opportunity for the British people to decide. But we need to be a little bit more intelligent about this. We need to understand that across this country, there are a huge number of disaffected people who voted for Brexit for two reasons. One, immigration, and the other one is this sense of inequality and lack of opportunities through the country. So in requesting a referendum, we need to be smarter about this. We need to understand that immigration does need to be addressed. But if you looked at the recent immigration report, what it actually showed is that 75% of immigration is from outside Europe, that European immigrants are net contributors of £800 per annum to our economy, and that non-European immigrants are a net cost of £2,100 to our economy. So if the government wanted to tackle immigration, there is a mechanism that it could have been done with. It's like taking medication for good cholesterol to get rid of all your cholesterol. It's completely crazy. But there is a political will, and if there was a political will to actually address the problem, then you get a lot more people on side with the idea that Brexit is not the solution to the immigration problem. In fact, Brexit is completely the wrong solution. And we also need to get more serious about the redistribution of wealth and opportunities. I travel a lot around this country. I spend time in Halifax and in the northeast, and this perception that the South had it easy and good, and that this is some sort of retribution and a way of balancing it out, is strongly felt in those parts of the country. And politicians have failed to grasp that fact and have failed to offer a solution to that, so people took Brexit as the only solution they could find. We need to offer political solutions, and then we'll get people on board with what we're trying to ask for, which is for people to think sensibly again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John. And now we turn to Rosa Ashby, who's a florist in Witney, who will talk to us about how her trade might be affected by Brexit barriers.
Okay. I'm going to stand up as well. Right. We have a flower shop in Witney, in Wesley Walk. We've had our shop for 21 years. We import all our goods, 100% of our flowers come from Holland. So it's had an impact already. Immediately after the referendum, our flowers went up about 20%. We couldn't pass that on to the customer completely because of the competition of supermarkets. So and that was a terrible already effect. I am asked by customers, why don't you grow your flowers and get them from England? I've tried. Because my name is Rosa, I have got a big supply of roses and Lisianthus and Oriental lilies. None of the English suppliers that I looked at, I could get none of those varieties. The only thing I could get was Alstroemeria throughout the year. How can I stock my shop with one variety of flowers? It's impossible. The other thing is, I was asked just on Monday to give a quote for a wedding for next April. How can I? How can I? Because I don't know what's going to happen. I've talked to 2 of my Dutch suppliers about Brexit. They're not happy because they have said to me, well, it's England's fault. I said, well, what am I going to do? What have you been instructed in Holland? They said, well, nothing really. Tariffs probably will go on, which will put the price up. If there's customs to go through, that will delay the flowers. So where now I can get my flowers in at between 3 and 5 in the morning, they've got a key of our shop. I have no idea when we'd get our flowers. Some customers have come into the shop that voted leave and have said to me, you're panicking. Am I? They said, don't worry, everything will be all right. Give it 3 years. Give it 3 years? So how will I survive for 3 years? What's going to happen? I'm surprised and amazed. It's all generations. It's not just older people either. It's some of the younger ones. Some shops, I say, will be all right. Barbers, hairdressers, beauticians, coffee shops, possibly. But what about we're getting fresh goods? We have no concept of what we're going to do come March. We have no idea because the government doesn't know. So how can we know? We deal with people's problems too. We have funerals, we have weddings, we get to know our customers personally. It's not just a big national company, we're a small business. When people come in, often upset, we comfort them, we talk to them about their problems. Then they decide to order maybe for a funeral, happy, sad occasions. Well, that will all go. From the referendum, from the time of the referendum up until May this year, 1,900 florists have closed across the country. From May to October, I don't know, but more have closed. That's their livelihoods. That's what they've been known to do. They've trained as florists. People say, oh, we can get the flowers in a supermarket. Yes, they can. And they can fly the flowers in, possibly from Kenya. I don't know. But the Dutch have known their trade for many years. They know they have good quality. I don't know what's going to happen. I wish I did, because I've no idea. From my accent, I'm sure you've gathered, I'm from Northern Ireland. I've lived over here for more than 30 years. I grew up through the Troubles. My father's business was bombed twice. He had a heart attack and died as a result. We lost our home when I was 12 the next day. Somebody died that night. I was a social worker. I had to go into areas to get children out. I had to look under my car before I got into it every single time. Now, if that border comes back, that will bring back big problems, because there's been peace, relative peace anyway, for the last few years. I love my country, and I still regard myself as Northern Irish. But what will happen? I don't know. I'm worried about that. I'm very worried about my business. No one can give me an answer. I've spoken to our MP, who I invited to come tonight. Well, I don't see him. So I just hope that and pray that something will materialise in the next few months to help, because it's very sad. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosa, for this very heartfelt account. It's actually very depressing, to be fair. I now turn to Susan Hartman, who's a partner and general manager at Metaphysics. And if you could, maybe you can use that microphone and see if that one is problematic as well, please signal that.
Okay.
Yes.
How's that sound? Can you hear me all right? I'm Susan Hartman. I'm the founder partner in a business called Metaphysics, and we deal very specifically in orthopaedic trauma, which is obviously medical devices. And whatever affects us affects thousands of medtech businesses, SMEs, here in the UK. And for the last 2 years, we've been trying to get somebody to engage with us of exactly what a no-deal Brexit would mean. 4 weeks ago, we had a letter. Excuse me if I start to get angry, because actually my blood boils as I tell the story. We've got a letter from Matt Hancock 4 weeks ago. It's a 2-page letter, and I won't bother to bore you with it because I can sum it up in 3 lines for you. The first is, we don't know what's going to happen, but we're sure it's going to be all right. But just in case, will you stockpile? Now, that's really not much help to us at all. And as with all documents, the sting was really in the is in the detail, where there's all sorts of attachments to go through. And the short answer is that if we leave with no deal, on the 30th of March next year, we could actually lose all our registrations and be out of business. So it's quite a very simple answer. Fortunately, we didn't wait for his letter. So for the last 12 months, we've been making plans. But for you to understand the plans that we've had to make, and please forgive me if anybody else is in the medical device sector, because I'll just repeat what you already know. But we're regulated, and to sell our products here in the UK and in the EU and a number of other countries around the world, since 1997, we've had to have what's known as a CE mark. To get a CE mark, it's all part of a quality procedure because it's guaranteeing the safety and efficacy of our products. Then, for here in the UK, we have to have a competent authority that can issue the CE marks. For us, that's the MHRA, the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency. They, in turn, assign to notified bodies, such as BSI, British Standards Institute, LRQA, there's a number of them. But if we leave without a deal, then MHRA is no longer a competent authority, and anybody that signed up to MHRA no longer has their body there. So what we've been doing in that time is signing up to a German notified body, so that on the 30th of March next year we can still continue our business, which means that we can still sell in Europe. We'll be able to sell in the UK. Well, we wouldn't be able to sell in the UK if we don't keep our CE mark, because Matt Hancock very kindly told us that this NHS will continue to accept a CE mark. That doesn't help British businesses that don't have one. We won't be able to sell to them. But it also means we can continue selling to Australia, we can continue selling to Turkey, we can continue selling to Saudi Arabia and others. Oddly enough, isn't this all about other world business? Well, they're trying to shut it off for us because we can be without that. The other issue for us is customs delays. So we're in trauma. So as one of our very good nurses says, the poor sod that's going to have your product tomorrow isn't even injured yet. So it's not like we can send it out weeks in advance. We have customs delays. If we have a customs delay, that's a big problem. When I ship something tonight, if I get it to UPS by 7 o'clock, I can have it in Berlin for 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. I can have it in Birmingham for 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. When I ship to the US, we've got our FDA, we've got everything that's there. We've paid lots of money for it. All of that's fine, but I don't know how long it's going to take to get through customs. I can ship it at 7 o'clock tonight. I can know that by the end of tomorrow it's actually in the USA, but I don't know when it's going to come through customs. Sometimes it's 1 day, the longest we've had is 12 days. And then all of our margins being used up in paying UPS or FedEx or somebody to try and expedite it through customs, because we've got a surgeon at the other end waiting to treat a patient. So if they give us those sorts of customs delays across Europe, we're in trouble. So what are we doing as a business? We're building more and more stock, and we're putting it in to our customers on consignment. So that's a cost to us. We can't ask them to pay for it till they use it, but we're holding stock in all sorts of places so that we can continue to supply our customer. They talk about tariffs. Tariffs actually are the least problem for us. When you see about the two other issues, tariffs only hit your margin. The other two things kill your business. And so that's no good to us at all. The other issue really comes around gamma irradiation. Some of our products provided sterile packed, so they get gamma irradiated. If we're not part of Euratom, we don't know whether we'll be able to get stuff gamma irradiated as quickly as we can now. There's likely to be a big backlog. If they're not being able to get the isotopes, we won't be able to sterilise products here in the UK. So that's another big worry for us. And 12 months ago, I was contacted by the University of Utrecht asking if I would take part in a survey for them. So I did. So the first number of questions were quite sort of generic and quite harmless. And then it came down to the nitty-gritty. Well, what about Brexit? What are you doing about Brexit? Is there a good business opportunity in the Netherlands if we set up to be a middleman just across the border for you? We'll hold your stock, we'll ship out to your customers. So they're all geared for it, way, way better than our businesses. The letter that we had from Matt Hancock just 4 weeks ago, the EU sent out to all our customers in January 2018, warning them that we might not have our CE mark ready. So we're now changing from our current provider to another CE mark. People that issue the CE mark have a number. So our current one is CE 0088. That goes on all our packaging. It gets laser marked onto the pieces of metal. These go into patients. So if that piece has to fail, we have a 15-year traceability requirement. So it gets laser marked on there. So if it fails, you can come back and see exactly who it is and what the lot number is and all the rest of it. Anything that we have laser marked with the wrong number, we have a little bit of leeway when we can use it. Otherwise, that becomes scrap. So now we're spending hours and time just trying to get that fixed. So it's really, really bad. So it's affecting all SMEs, it's affecting the bigger businesses as well, but obviously they have divisions pretty much in every European country, so it's easier for them. It's easier for them to switch. We're listening to our politicians talking about no deal is better than a bad deal. It is not. Canada Super Plus, or whatever it is they're talking about now, that doesn't work. That's tariffs. That doesn't work for me at all. The only thing, if we can't stay in the EU, the only thing that works for us and our businesses to keep it flowing smoothly is we need to be in the single market and we need to be in the customs union. Anything less will give us not just immediate troubles. We're confident that we'll be able to continue to supply customers for the next 6 and 12 months after the 30th of March, because we've built in those safeguards. After that, we don't know how much more we know. It's already cost us as a small business £40,000 to £50,000 making these provisions. And so quite simply, all I will say is every pound that we've spent, every hour that we've spent doing this is £1 an hour that we've not spent building our business, creating jobs and building stuff for the country. And it's about time that people start listening. And all the people I've tried to engage in it, including our MP, Robert Quartz, doesn't give a flying fig. So, sorry, I'm getting cross. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Susan, I now turn to Ian Middleton, who's the Managing Director of Argentius.
Hello, yes. I'm actually a writer and a Green Party activist, so kind of find Brexit quite important. But I'm here to talk about my life as a retailer, which started just over the road. before we spread out across the country. But it's something I also campaign on. In 2017, the retail sector as a whole contributed 11% of total economic output at £194 billion. It generates around 5% of GDP and employs about 4.6 million people. With 15.2% of total employment, it's the largest single industrial sector in the country. The UK's retail expertise is internationally recognised and attracted brands from the EU worth £58 billion in 2016. And retail is one of the largest areas for small businesses. At the last count, there were 173,000 small independent retailers in the UK. It's an industry that's easy to enter, and even more so now with the advent of the internet. Many people started as I did with a market stall or a small pop-up shop. But smaller businesses have far less resilience to major upsets like Brexit. Taken individually, we might not see that as a big problem. But considering the large number of small businesses operating in this sector, we could have a large impact if they all go to the wall en masse. We're already seeing price increases due to the fall in the value of sterling. And as prices go up and real terms earnings potentially go down as a result of a post-Brexit economic decline, some stores will see reduced sales as people prioritise spending on other essentials. As one of the largest employers of unskilled labour, announcements this week that Theresa May will end free movement for such people are very worrying. Migrants aren't coming over here to take British jobs. They're doing the jobs that Brits mostly don't want to do. For example, in the early 2000s, we were expanding but struggling to find staff. When Poland and other Eastern European countries joined the EU, it was like somebody had waved a magic wand. Polish applicants showed up for interviews when lots of Brits didn't. They were articulate, friendly, punctual, and they enjoyed shop work. We were suddenly fishing in a much larger pool for staff, but that pool has been drying up since the referendum. And this government's renewed attack on freedom of movement risks draining it completely. Customs arrangements are also important for the retail sector due to cross-border sales and supply arrangements. If import tariffs do kick in, home producers may also take the opportunity of raising their own prices as the market value of their goods effectively goes up. Added to other financial pressures they already face, this could lead to the end of some smaller retailers. Many companies rely on just-in-time supply chain models, and retailers are no different. Large supermarkets don't build much back-office space into their storage capacity as they maximise floor space for selling space. With many goods and ingredients coming from abroad, customs delays could mean empty shelves. This isn't just an inconvenience for consumers, it represents lost revenue to stores. Meanwhile, landlords will still want their rent paid, and business rates, wages and other overheads will still be due. The government has responded by appointing a Minister of Food Supplies who just happens to be a former retailer himself. But supply chain chiefs have already warned that port delays of 30 minutes could bankrupt 1 in 10 businesses, including some retailers. We've all heard the plans to stockpile goods, but warehouses are hard to find, and property brokers are saying space is extremely limited. Online stores aren't going to be immune either. Many of them hold very little stock of their own. Instead, they rely on drop shipping, where third-party fulfills orders direct to customers. And this could be the supplier or a distribution centre or a fulfilment centre. The problem arises if these centres are located outside the UK, as they sometimes are. For example, I'm in the process of setting up an online store now looking to drop ship products from a company in Netherlands. Right now, they can send direct to our customers with no problems. After Brexit, if import tariffs and border checks apply, not only will this mean slower deliveries, it could also mean orders being stopped and held at customs. Our customers might then have to pay import duty and VAT before they can get their purchases, and that's not going to go down too well. The same problem applies the other way round when we have to send custom returns back to the EU. Those goods will be treated as a re-export involving the same processes, paperwork, taxes and other payments. This again impacts on smaller businesses more than larger ones, because large multinationals like Amazon have fulfilment and returns operations in the EU as well as here. So they'll be able to circumvent this to some extent. Last but not least, there's the position of all of us as consumers and the protections and advantages we've all enjoyed as members of the EU. We'll lose many of those if the government makes their promised bonfire of regulations to improve competitiveness. That not only means less protections for workers, it also means less consumer rights and reduced access to a competitive market in the EU. EU consumer legislation has given us all standardised protection for online purchases, and for example in the jewellery sector, things like the EU nickel directives have ensured customer safety. The EU credit surcharge ban also came in this year, and this has prevented an extra £166 million a year being added to UK consumers' credit cards. But even more worryingly, credit card payments themselves could be seriously impacted by a no-deal Brexit. UK businesses could lose direct access to central payments infrastructure, meaning customers will be faced with increased costs and slower processing times for EU transactions. And we all remember how much disruption was caused earlier this year by a simple technical glitch. I'll end with a report published today by business consultants Korn Ferry. Their retail survey quantifies the views of 34 retail leaders employing more than 1.45 million people, with a collective annual revenue exceeding 261 billion. They report that pessimism about the future of retail is at its highest level since the 2012 at the peak of the recession. Over 90% of those interviewed expressed uncertainty about what Brexit would mean for their business, while a further 80% said they were not prepared for it. Most believe consumer confidence would be adversely affected by the UK's departure from the EU, but they did end on a note of optimism, as many still expected their businesses to grow post-Brexit. I still think they're sticking their heads in the sand. Which is why I'm fighting for an end to this collective madness and calling for a second vote to end the uncertainty and the damage that this self-destructive, self-defeating Brexit obsession has already done to this country. But we have to act now before the shutters come down, not just on many high street stores, but on the whole of the UK. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ian. And if I can now turn to Tom Fowle, who's the how would you describe yourself? A business analyst. I'll let you describe yourself.
Okay. Right. So I'm a serial entrepreneur. I've currently got a cybersecurity business and a couple of other small startups. But over the past several years, I've been looking in depth, because I'm a business analyst, at the impact, the economic impact of Brexit on the UK, on UK businesses, and what it means, how people have to react to it, how businesses have to react to it. So that's what I'm going to cover tonight. There's a book by a guy called Jim Collins called Good to Great, and it's not a great book, but it does have a few interesting homilies in it, one of which is face the brutal facts. Businesses have to be able to understand what might impact their business environment, and this is everything from fire, flood, earthquake, through to, as we now know, Brexit. I'm not going to give you any financial predictions. I'm going to just relay one little thing, which is that the government's own predictions in its the hidden secret studies that it has say that in the worst case of no deal Brexit, the impact will be about 8% of GDP. To give you a comparison, the impact of the financial crash in 2008 was 2% of GDP. So this is potentially 4 times worse. That means we're almost certainly going to have a big recession. So businesses have to create contingency plans in order to deal with this. And contingency plans always work on the worst possible case. You have to plan for the worst case. In the last recession, there were people were too conservative. They weren't aggressive enough in their contingency planning. We survived because we had a very senior financial chairman who told us exactly what was going to happen, and we just about recovered at the time. So the most important thing about contingency planning is keeping the company solvent, keeping it going, and that's what I'll cover in this. In that 8%, only 1% is tariffs. All the rest is non-tariff barriers. UK businesses have been very good at taking advantage of the UK's freedoms, the freedom of movement, the freedom of movement of capital, and the freedom of moving goods around. And what that's meant is that, as we heard from Rosa, We both specialise, so there are lots of things we no longer do that we used to do. We've become very good at doing other things that rely on the freedom of movement, etc. So businesses like car manufacturing, that relies on the free movement of goods, the fast free movement of goods, in order to do just-in-time manufacturing. That just-in-time manufacturing takes a huge amount of cost out of the storage of parts and the progress of parts through the system in order to keep the cost of cars down. It's the same with aeronautical manufacturing. We rely very much on free movement there and on free movement of goods. The fresh goods, flowers, meat, fruit industries, agricultural industries in general, they rely on the fast movement of goods. A lot of our goods, about 50% of our food, comes in from Europe. It won't be available fresh immediately after Brexit. In fact, it's likely to take several days to get through. So all of the fresh food that we currently rely on coming in from Holland and from Spain is going to stop. Finance relies on passporting. And on free movement. It's a services industry. So people will no longer be able to go to Europe when they need to. In my industry, I need to be able to get customers to an incident, to get people to an incident within about 2 hours. So I've got to be able to get people on a plane and over to the customer to deal with what is usually a growing crisis. I won't be able to do that after Brexit. So I will have to put people in Europe. So, what does that mean for the UK economy? Brexit is like putting a wall all of the way around the UK that costs money and time to cross in both directions, both out of the UK in exports and into the UK in imports. That wall is 8%. It's all of those non-tariff barriers, etc. So it differs for different businesses. Different businesses will have different effects. Some will not see much of an effect. So some businesses I talk to that, for instance, in luxury goods, they don't have much of an effect. I've got another business I deal with that is basically importing goods from China to various countries. It manages the process, but it doesn't actually import and export. But what businesses are going to have to do is work out how to deal with that wall. And one of the things they will do is they will stop exporting. They'll look to work out ways to avoid crossing the wall. And that means businesses like Jaguar Land Rover and the Chinese car manufacturers, they will move manufacturing. They're already in the process of doing so. Businesses that service those companies, they are, one of them I'm advising at the moment, they are swapping contracts with each other, swapping contracts and technologies, so that the tier one manufacturers that supply just in time to the car manufacturers are doing it all within country. That means they're not exporting. Now, we have a balance of payments issue. We currently import more than we export. And we sustain that balance of payments by, well, part of it's paid for by our exports. So if our exports drop, we can no longer afford to import as much. The other part is covered off by selling the UK's assets. And we've been doing that for many years. We eventually run out of assets to sell. At that point, the economy crashes. There is no other option available. So, Mark Carney, the Governor of the Bank of England, said that we rely on the kindness of strangers. So we've relied for a long time on the kindness of strangers, believing that the value of the UK's assets is worth investing in. After Brexit, it will be a fire sale, because that's all that's left. So what are businesses doing about it? Well, EasyJet has already left. It's moved its headquarters to Austria. Thomas Cook, if you read their conditions on travel after Brexit, their terms and conditions, they say, we do not guarantee any refunds. They're treating it as, they're putting it in exactly the same category as a
disaster.
As a disaster. So, French hauliers are refusing to accept contracts for transport to the UK after Brexit. So lots of businesses are having to react now. They don't have time to wait to find out what happens to Brexit. They have to deal with worst case conditions. So if anyone needs any information to help them plan, I've got lots. I've got huge amounts of information that can help you understand exactly what it will take to survive Brexit. Businesses should be thinking about consolidation. They should be thinking about whether to lose staff. You should be worrying about whether you can retain staff. A number of businesses have moved overseas purely because they can no longer get staff, the foreign staff that were populating their business in the UK. I know a number of businesses like that, where the expertise actually comes from different countries to operate a business here. So there's lots of things that can be done, but we have to plan for the worst case. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. So what we'll do now is we'll move to a few responses that we've asked for from elected representatives of some activist groups here, and then I'll open it up for some additional contributions from the floor, and then we'll come back to the panel. So if I can first ask Annelies Dodds and Piers, Shadow Treasury Minister, to respond, as it were.
Thank you very much. And I think we've heard some very powerful testimonies from people tonight. They very much accord with what I've heard from other businesses, creatives and scientists, not just here in Oxford, but right across the country actually. It's not going to be possible to respond to everything without letting other people speak. So I'm going to try and concentrate my response really around what people have said on people, on regulations and on EU funding. And then what they said about a no-deal Brexit and failure to roll that out. And finally talk a little bit about where some of the politics are now as well, particularly within the House of Commons, so that people get an idea of that. First of all, when it comes to the issue of mobility, I think we've had very, very clear examples of why trying to, in particular, just place the existing migration regime for non-EU people onto EU people will be an absolute and utter disaster. It was interesting hearing about the likely system for musicians potentially if we ended up in that situation. My office, we deal routinely with huge problems that are being caused by the Home Office and Borders Agency for non-EU migrants. But we had a situation where a Syrian oud player, believed to be the best in the world, I understand was told by the Home Office he couldn't come in because he didn't have specific enough skills. So we're looking at that kind of farcical situation potentially being applied right across the board. We cannot have that, and in particular, we can't have a situation where salary is used as a proxy for the contribution that people could make. And I thought we were getting somewhere on that. We had a debate with the Universities Minister where I made this point, many other people did, and it sounded like they were listening, and yet we seem to be slipping back into that after this week, unfortunately. So we've got to resist that approach. We need to make clear that exactly as was mentioned, it's about people's families as well. It's not just about individuals, and it's about having a flexible system that means that people can come for short periods of time, potentially, when they need to. And exactly what was mentioned about the arts, I think, could be applied as well to science and technology. I know, for example, at the BMW plant, very often they'll have people coming in for relatively short periods dealing with specific robots, that kind of thing. You can't have an inflexible system without really impacting very negatively indeed on our economy. And of course, this is about people's working conditions as well. And I very much recognise what a number of people said on that already. Again, if we look at the non-EU situation, even the situation actually for countries that have got trade deals with the EU, actually it's often very, very difficult for people to operate there, either as individuals or as companies. So I've been trying to help a company, for example, trying to carry out business in Ukraine. Very, very difficult in terms of the paperwork. And that's a country that's got a trade deal with the EU that we wouldn't even be covered by potentially if we have this chaotic no-deal Brexit that hasn't been ruled out. We heard a lot about regulation, which I think was enormously helpful. And I would just add on that, I think that we've had some very unfortunate developments that I've continually pushed back against, unfortunately, coming from the British side on this, because we've somehow ended up in a situation where many of the EU 27 think that the UK is seeking to undercut their regulations in different areas. It started with the cut in corporation tax, we then had threats of cuts to financial regulation, in other areas clinical trials, etc., where we would not benefit from shifting from the EU regulatory system, quite the opposite actually. And that I think has been very, very damaging, because it's leaching away some of the goodwill that we need to show that we're genuinely interested in regulatory cooperation in future. Moving on then to a situation around no deal, and exactly what many people have said accords with my experience of talking, as I said, with other businesses. I think Rose's position in particular, saying, well, we just don't know what the situation will be, is very, very common. And that's because people haven't been given that indication, and the description of the information that people have got from government is one that I very much recognise. Only for some sectors we now have these papers on planning for no deal, but actually there's a real paucity of information even in those papers, and they haven't been provided for lots of other areas. So it's very, very concerning. And there are big questions when you're asking companies to do things like stockpile. That's very expensive, right, for the reasons that we've just been talking about. Who's going to pay for it? Government has now said, oh, well, we might somehow consider covering somehow some of pharmaceutical companies' costs for this. What's about manufacturing? Are they going to be covering the cost if we end up with BMW having to have an additional huge lorry park, for example? It's already difficult for them to move goods around currently, let alone with that kind of situation. So we really should not be in a position where a no-deal Brexit is being countenanced. And I think it's very unfortunate that despite the building evidence about the damage this is already doing, we now have a Brexit secretary who will say there could be countervailing opportunities from a no-deal Brexit. Well, there cannot be countervailing opportunities. I don't see any. I can't identify any of it. I don't know if anybody else can. I can't. We need to be very clear about the cost that would be caused, and we've got to rule out that no deal. What individuals have already said about the economic impact, I think, is all absolutely right. And I would just add on that immediately after the referendum, many people said, well, we didn't have an immediate impact. Of course, they forgot about the fall of the pound, didn't talk about that. But they also forgot about the fact that there was a big regulatory response. The bank very quickly responded. There was action that was taken. If we have, however, the kind of administrative, bureaucratic and other blockages that may well result from a no deal, it will not be possible to deal with those in the way that it was possible for regulators to deal with the referendum result before. And I've been, over the last few weeks, I've been touring some of the HMRC offices in different parts of the country, and it's going to be those people, it's going to be civil servants and administrators who are going to have to try and deal with the possible chaos that could result if we have a no-deal Brexit. Many of them are already massively overworked and stretched, and they really do not see how they're going to be able to cope with this, particularly, I'd say, on the customs side, where we've got very, very significant challenges, as has already been mentioned. Obviously, we've talked about the border situation in Northern Ireland, and Northern Ireland, that clearly has not been dealt with properly at all. And really, we should be in a situation where government recognises that we have got to have a contingency plan. I mean, personally, I don't think that their suggestions for future customs arrangements would work at all. I cannot see a possible future in which they would work. We've got to have alignment. That means having a customs union with the EU. That's the only sensible way to go. But government hasn't offered an alternative if it won't even get through its deals yet. They've said there can be no backstop, there can be no staying within a customs union, even for a limited period of time, if we don't get agreements. That's extremely concerning, and actually I tackled Jubilee directly about this in the House of Commons in relation to BMW. I got absolutely nothing back. They haven't been listening on this, and they need to listen. And I hope the fact that many businesses are actually spelling out the impact now will get them to a better position, because until now we've not always had business voices going out there because they've been concerned about being shouted down and about being vilified. So it's really good that you have been raising your voices. So what's next? Well, we've obviously got the vote coming up in Parliament on the deal. Labour's, as many of you will know, been pushing for that to be a meaningful vote. Currently, government just seems to be offering us Theresa May's deal, as flawed as it looks like it's going to be, or no deal. That's not acceptable. We should have another option. We haven't got there yet, however. Assuming that May can't get the deal through, many of you will know that we're saying that means there's got to be a general election, because that means a really fundamental failure of leadership. If we don't get that, then we think there should be other means of democratic engagement. I think it's good that Labour Conference in particular said in those circumstances we shouldn't be ruling out going for another vote. Not a second referendum, a different vote, because it's in different circumstances. And that just leads me on to the final point that I wanted to make, and very much related to what was said about the polarisation that we're seeing at the moment in our country. I think it's absolutely essential that in all of this discussion, we never forget the fact that people's living standards in the UK have been stagnating for a very long period now, for the longest period since the Napoleonic Wars. There's no surprise that there is polarisation. And unless we deal with those problems with people's living standards, when we talk about these issues, we could have a huge backlash. And that is the big concern that I have, that we must deal with those living standards issues, and we must show solidarity amongst ourselves, across those boundaries, and above all, with our European friends who live here, who are welcome here, welcome in our city of Oxford.
Thank you very much, Marisa. We now, of course, when we return to points around the next steps. I mean, I expect some people might want to query the more detailed version of what those options on the table will be in a potential vote. Our next speaker is going to be Councillor Liz Leffman, the Oxfordshire County Council. I should say we have invited the other Oxford MP for Oxford Abingdon, Laila Moran, who had a prior engagement. Liz stood as a Liberal candidate in Witney, a constituency that was mentioned earlier today, and is a business person herself. So Liz, 5 minutes.
Thank you. And what strikes me, listening to all of you, is that I think we should take this and send this to Theresa May and send it to her cabinet members, because clearly they do not understand in any way, shape or form the pressures that people like yourselves have to face. It's absolutely clear to me. Every single one of you has got a story to tell. You're all in different sectors, you've all got different types of businesses. We could have brought in people from the farming community today who told a similar story. The fact is that no deal is going to be a disaster for numerous businesses in this country, and we have to do everything we can to stop that from happening, unless we want our country to be a poorer country, and we want people to find themselves in a poorer situation than one they're in. And what Annalisa was saying is absolutely right. We have to make sure that we don't allow living standards to drop in this country, but unfortunately, it seems to me that a no deal is going to make that happen. Because we are going to see jobs lost in some sectors. Bizarrely, we will probably see other sectors desperate for people to come and work. If you think about the number of people who are working in the city of Oxford right now, in things like cafes, in the hospitality sector, all those sectors are going to really struggle. The care sector, for heaven's sake, how are we going to manage? There are 90,000 vacancies in the care sector right now across the country. What is it going to be like when we come to the end of March? It's going to be even more difficult to recruit people. And I think it's probably the case that we're seeing problems with recruitment precisely because people haven't got the certainty that they need to be able to come to this country and work in the sector where they don't know whether they're going to have a job eventually. I know numerous people who find themselves in this situation. I was here I think it was the beginning of 2017, we had a similar meeting here where a number of people in the audience were struggling to find ways that a lot of EU nationals living in Oxford were struggling to find a means of being able to stay. So it is an absolute disaster. And what I've written down are a number of things common themes which have come out. The first thing, the most important thing, is the uncertainty that Rosa and others mentioned about the current situation and what's going to happen when we finally do leave. The other thing is that we are going to become less competitive. We already are. I run a business in the clothing sector, and I run it in Romania. And I can remember what it was like before Romania joined the EU. It was very, very difficult to get paperwork together to bring things across various borders out of Romania and into the UK. And my real fear is we're going to see a repetition of that, but it's going to be the other way around, because you'll have a free movement of goods in the EU itself. When we get to the border with France and Britain, it's going to be a problem. So that I can foresee as being a major problem, and that will be an additional cost. And I don't know if you've heard, recently there was something on the radio I heard the other day, which was saying that whereas we have seen deflation in the clothing sector for the last 20 or 30 years, we've suddenly started to see prices creeping up, and that's partly because of the fall in the pound, but also because of the costs associated with it. A number of people working in that sector, again, are not actually staying here, they're going home. So additional costs are all part of it as well. The other thing that I thought was particularly interesting, what Andy was saying about our cultural relationship with the EU, and that loss of cultural leadership, which I think is a tragedy, frankly, that we find ourselves in a situation where we could actually see our musicians not being able to get work, and not just musicians, others as well in the cultural sector. So these are the things that I picked up from what you're saying. They certainly concur with the things that I've seen in my own sector and the business that I run. The question of what we're going to do will come up. I won't say anything about that now, but just to say thank you to all of you. And if we've got something on tape, we should be sending it out there, making sure that people hear the message, because that's been the problem. I think people have not heard the message. Businesses have been very reluctant to come out. They are beginning to start to be more bullish about saying this is going to be a disaster, we are going to see job losses and costs going up. But we've got to make that point, and we've got to make it quickly. And that's why it's so important that these sorts of meetings are held up and down the country. So thank you to everybody that's organised this today, and thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, please. I should just say that we are recording this professionally, and we do intend for clips to be circulated as widely as possible and as soon as possible. So our next speaker is Councillor Greg Simmons, and if at this stage again, because we're not yet at the what should we do next day, if I can ask you to talk specifically about the Sustainable Communities Act motion that was passed in the City Council this week.
Well, thank you very much. I'll perhaps stand. So I'm a local city councillor for the Greens, and over the last years, both before Brexit and since, I've either proposed or seconded 5 motions to the council. In fact, they're the only 5 motions that have gone on concerning Brexit to the council. All been trying to resist Brexit, but also try to make the city council more of a voice for the people who voted Remain in the city, which is over 70% of the population. And the most recent of those, which Ruth has asked me to talk about, is one that was only passed this last Monday, which was essentially using the Sustainable Communities Act, which is an act that the government passed, well, it's amended in 2010, it was originally in 2009, that actually allows local authorities to make proposals to the government that they feel will be in the social and economic well-being of the businesses and communities in their area. And so I'd seen what Plymouth Council had done, which is actually written to ministers saying, actually what we really need to do to look after the welfare of our local communities and business is to know what the hell is happening after Brexit, because we've got no idea. And we know that there are these reports on the economic impact which have been done. They've been kept secret. We know they're there because BBC and Sky leaked them back in February of this year. They still haven't been published. And so what we're doing as a council, it was passed almost unanimously by the council on Monday, across party, was to actually write to the Minister asking them to release these reports on the economic impact of Brexit on our local businesses, our local economy and our local communities, because without that we cannot do our best for our local people.
Thanks very much, Greg. And of course, we'll return later to the City Council's role in the People's Vote, etc. Thanks very much for that contribution. Can I now try to find Harry? Is Harry there? So we've got a representative from Young Conservatives for a People's Vote, just to demonstrate that this is, as I said at the start, a non-party political event. And so, Harry, if you can tell us that, as you were, that case.
Well, just saying, we do exist. I'm a Conservative, but I'm proud of British business. I'm proud to support its future. And its future is in jeopardy in the Brexit. The Conservative Party calls itself the party of business. But as we stare to March 29, there isn't a business in Britain that gets a good deal from Brexit. That's why we've launched Conservatives for People's Vote. On Monday, we hosted an event at the Conservative Party conference in Birmingham that was censored by the Conservative Party. The turnout was amazing. People were standing in the hallway, unable to hear what was going on in the room, just because they wanted to be on the right side of history on Brexit. The movement is growing daily. On Sunday, if you follow us on Twitter, we're almost near 1,000 followers, so we'd really like to push that. The silent voices remain within the Conservative Party, don't want to be silent anymore. We want to get the best for business, and the best for business is not removing ourselves from our friends, our family, inside the European Union, and the biggest trading bloc in the world. It's not supporting the ability to collaborate, and we're a university city. Our collaborations go across the world. We have some of the best academics at both universities from across Europe, and it's going to affect our city massively. It is not restricting our right to work anywhere in Europe as well. These are the ways business is damaged. It's the way that Britain is damaged, and it's the way that Britain falls apart. I'm a student. My housemate's Scottish, and things aren't looking good there either, are they? We all don't know I'm shaking so much. I speak to more people normally. We're all here today because we have a common belief in Europe, and you have the ability to help get the best for Britain. The time is now for you to stand up and fight for Britain. It doesn't matter about your political allegiance here. It's about getting the best for Britain. It's about getting the best for Oxford. Whether it be spreading the word locally or campaigning nationally, it's time that we all work together to get the best for Britain, to get the best for Oxford, and get the best for the future generations as well.
Thank you very much, Harry. And so our last invited contributor before I open it up for short contributions from the audience or questions to the panelists, and then moving on to the political bit is Dominic Bryan, who's with Our Future, Our Choice, or OFOC.
So, I absolutely echo what Harry was saying, that young people across the country are absolutely fighting for a people's vote and fighting for this. I would say that, so I'm a student at Oxford. I run Our Future, Our Choice on campus. I think it's clear that the opportunities for students at these universities have been incredibly badly hit by the structured Brexit. I think the universities have been clear about impacts that a Brexit will have on research funding. They've been clear that it's incredibly negative. I think that's bad not just for the university, that's bad for the city as a whole, the benefits from the money that comes in, the jobs that come in. It's bad for students who won't get taught by world-leading academics, who won't get taught by people who are experts in their field collaborating internationally. Increasingly, this isn't just a question that the government can solve by throwing money at. It's about those cultural ties, it's about new institutions, it's about those academic international links that will be hit by Brexit. And there are wider problems that students will face with Brexit. Students will lose access to the Erasmus scheme. The government has consistently failed to say that they can keep it going past 2020. Funding for Erasmus projects has not been guaranteed past the current funding round. So there is incredibly damaging potentials to students. But there are also international students. About 15% of students at this university come from the EU. And they're not only facing uncertainty about whether they'll be able to stay in this country after leaving the European Union, but also leaving the European Union. There is also the risk of how many people put off. How many people have thought, Brexit never will. I think the opportunity cost of EU nationals not coming to this country, not enriching the intellectual, academic, social and cultural life of this university and city is incredibly damaging. And so I think that's another reason why students are so united and serious in the support of the European Union. And I would add the fact that recent polling has been 85% of current students would back Remain, an overwhelming majority support people's vote. So I think it's clear that their views are very clear on that one. And I finally would say that at this university now, with the vast majority of first and second year undergraduates, a huge portion of the student vote, of the students in this country, did not get a vote in 2016. I was 17 at the time of the referendum. I didn't have a chance to have a say. And so that's why students up and down the country, students here in Oxford, at both universities in this great city, are fighting for people's vote and are fighting the voices to be heard. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Dominic. And of course, when we talk later about people's vote and a potential referendum, then the question of the franchise for that referendum is very significant indeed. So can I invite very short contributions? I'll try and take a group of them, and then we'll come back to the panel and we'll move on. So let me start with the lady just with the Barrett in the back, and we'll take them. Yeah, just. Yeah.
Hi, I am one of the EU nationals. I'm French and I will not have my 5 years by next March. I have 25 weeks ahead and I still don't really know if I have the right to stay. Because Theresa May in her last speech says she will guarantee the right of EU nationals under no deal scenario. We have 60 Brexit no's and none of them guarantee the right of EU citizens. Please analyze, take what has been agreed on the withdrawal agreement and ring-fence it to make, at least, to make sure we can stay.
Sure. Thanks very much. Yeah. Yes, please.
I'm Celia Wilson from Didcot. There's something that we're missing here, I think. Over the last couple of years, we have been mesmerised by a supposed inevitability of Brexit. Right from the beginning, it's Brexit must happen. And every time, all the speakers here have been speaking about when we leave the European Union, not if we leave. What's changed for me in the last 2 or 3 months has been the most amazing change that people are beginning to question that. And what I would like to suggest to this audience, though, is that it's not good enough simply to say, let's have a vote. What we have to do in order to overcome the mindset that has been pounded into us over 2 years that we are going to leave the European Union, that needs to be replaced by actually being able to imagine what it's going to be like if we stay in it. Because that is not something that has been discussed, or has very, very rarely been discussed.
Sure.
So we have to explore that new landscape in order to make it happen.
Sure. I mean, we'll come back, obviously, later to the question of the vote or alternatives to it, but we want to try and focus the question comments just on business for this moment. I should just say, I should clarify, I mean, obviously, we asked business people to respond to what will happen if we leave. But we actually started this panel by saying that our clear and present and urgent aim is to stop it. So just to make that very clear. Yes.
I used to be a rocket scientist. The reason I say this is Professor Andrew Harrison described what would happen at Diamond. I worked, first of all, with the European Space Agency and then with JET. And 28 years in all at Common Science Centre and so on. The key point I want to make is we needed the best brains. We couldn't retain, we can't now retain staff. I'm retired, so it's not my problem. We have funding uncertainties. We have uncertain programme because of the difficulty of being sure what will happen next. We need to work at the cutting edge. And we have families who are affected by this, which is making people uncertain and leave the country. You said every one of those things. I recognise them with people who have told me what's going on at the European Space Agency and at JET. And I also recognise it as a problem with Galileo and the military satellites that go with Galileo.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. I'll take about two more. So there's a gentleman here. And then we'll come back to that.
I run a small business that primarily, I won't say exports, sells into the EU. We sell industrial instrumentation. There's two of us. And we received a letter the other day from HMRC telling us about changes to the way we're going to be trading with the European Union. Very short. And the interesting point here is that at the bottom of the first page, it says the steps and obligations you may need to take to continue to trade with the EU if the UK leaves without a deal are broadly the same as those that apply to businesses that trade with countries outside of the EU. Then there's a list of links to a few introductory notes on HMRC's website so that you know what you're going to do. I printed those out. These are the introductory notes. This is double-sided. This doesn't tell me what I need to do. This is a list of the stuff that I need to read to know what I've got to do. There's two of us in this company. We're both quite busy. I'm not sure when I'm going to find the time to go through all that lot. I've had a quick skim. It seems this is going to involve lots of paperwork. So every time we want to ship something to the EU, I'm going to have to fill in customs declarations. We've got to get the company registered to be able to do exporting. And one of the things that people go on about is just in time for large companies. As I said, there's two of us. But we have suppliers in the UK. Two principal suppliers. One supplies electronics, one supplies metalwork. The equipment we sell is fairly big. I mean, it's about the length of that table, and it's about 3 meters tall. None of the businesses involved on the UK side are large. So we have to build this and then get it out of the building to the plant that it's going on to very quickly. We finish building it, we pack it up one night, it ships, I fly over, or my partner flies over to the site it's arriving at the next day, and we install it. That doesn't seem, from these notes, like it's going to be remotely possible if we leave the single market and customs union. And I guess I'm going to finish, I don't have much time, but the point that I've got from all this, from this letter and from all these notes, is that it's wrong to consider myself right now to be exporting to the EU. I self-evidently am not. What I do right now is not exporting. The EU is the market, is my home market. All of the small companies that are in my position have got to change their business model completely to become exporters. That is not a viable proposition. It just isn't. We may survive, if we're lucky, maybe won't. And then the companies that trade with us in the UK that don't export, they're going to end up being in trouble as well. This is going to cascade out. And it's very nice to hear people talking about retaining benefits. But as far as I can see, that's fiddling around the edges. The only way that we can continue to be successful as a small business that sells into Europe is to not leave the single market and to not leave the customs union. And to pretend any differently.
A very brief last contribution from the gentleman there, and then we'll go quickly to the panel and then to the politicians. Yes,
thank you. The speakers have all been admirably clear about the problems. The government, and it is the government that is responsible, is set on trashing the economy. But my question is this: do you not all feel disenfranchised? Because the responsibility of stopping this rests with Parliament. And yet I've heard virtually nothing from Parliament, from parliamentarians, along the lines of the cogent evidence that you have presented. Nor have I heard much from organs which pretend to represent business, like the Financial Times. I feel disenfranchised by my Parliament, not as it happens by the local MP, who I think is admirable on this subject. And I think that possibly most of the people in this room feel disenfranchised. Yes. And there's half the country, more or less, who happen to be well-informed, internationally minded, and concerned, who I submit are similarly feeling disenfranchised. My conclusion is this: should we not all be remorseless in saying it's you, Parliament, and it's you, Government, who are responsible for getting us out of this mess?
Sure. There we are. Thank you. I think we're getting a number of persistent segues to our next section, but I will want to give, before that, a chance to people on the panel, if there are brief responses, as it were, to the responses. Does anyone on this side want to come in on anything in particular? No?
I don't know.
Sorry, do you want to come in? So, yeah.
It was actually just the gentleman who... Oh, yeah, sorry. Hello. It was just the gentleman on his last point there. I totally feel the same way that you do about feeling disenfranchised. I think it's been, is it over 18 months now since Article 50 was triggered? And the fact that we've heard so little, I really feel it's a shocking dereliction of duty on the part of the government. So yeah, I think we probably all feel the same way about it, but I think they've had a long time to come up with something. Where is it?
Thank you.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you can pass it on to Susan, please.
Yeah, I totally agree with everybody. We need to do whatever we can, and it just strikes me that a lot of our parliamentarians are just running scared by just saying it's the will of the people. Well, put it back to the people and find out if it is still the will of the people. And I just think that we like to think that we're perhaps civilised and we know where we're going. We just need to make more noise now. We've got to make more noise so they become more scared of us than they are of the people they're trying to scare of. I lived through the 60s and 70s, and nothing at that time got me out on a protest march. I'm now a veteran of protest marches. If there's one, I'm there. I want to go to Sunderland on Saturday, but I can't quite make it. So I'm devastated. I'm going to send them messages. And if anybody else is worried about going on the protest march, they are great fun. If when this is finished and we've won, I shall have to find another cause, because it is great fun. Sure. And you meet all the different people. When we were on the London march last time, we were standing next to a lady called Isabel. She was 73, and she had cross-stitched her own banner in the manner of a Victorian sampler. I can't remember what the front said, because the back is what got the attention. Bugger Brexit, and that's what I think we need to do.
Okay, so thank you. And of course we'll talk about the market in a bit, so no, that's fine. Okay, so I want to thank all of our panelists on this for their very sobering account, which, as I said, is now well documented and will be disseminated. So if we can do some sort of a swap, and if I can ask our politicians to come to join us here. So Annalise, if you want to start off.
Great, thanks. Well, if I may, just before I do that, I would just want to say to our friend from France, and to reiterate what I said before, I think it's absolutely appalling that many people have been placed in a position where they feel like pawns at the moment in this kind of negotiation. It's an utterly inhumane way to treat people. And if from the beginning, and we should still do this, and I've consistently argued for this, if from the beginning we had said everybody from the EU 27 who is here is welcome to stay here, and we'd made that point consistently and not fallen into this tit for tat that has developed with other countries,
we would have much more goodwill in the rest of the EU 27, as well as removing that huge cause of uncertainty and distress for so many people. It's still where we need to be.
Yes,
it's still what we have to do. And I think that's probably the most important part, actually, a lot of the time that we need to focus on, because this is real people's lives that it's impacting on in such an extreme way. In terms of currently where Labour is on these questions, I don't want to reiterate in great detail what I said before. As I mentioned, there is going to be that vote on the deal, which is coming up. Labour wants there to be an additional option. We don't think just having Theresa May's failed deal or no deal is acceptable. Now, what we've got to do right now is make very clear that when we reject Theresa May's deal, which I think we'll have to, because there's no way it's going to pass those 6 tests that Keir Starmer set out, that I stood on the last election on the basis of, when we reject that deal, that must not be interpreted as support for no deal. It must not be. And when we talk about this, we've got to be aware that there are some extreme ideologues in the Conservative Party who are actively seeking no deal. Sadly, we've got one of them in the form of Dominic Raab, now as a member of the government. So I think the most important thing that Labour's got to do from now is to say, when we reject that deal, it does not mean support for no deal. It means a rejection of what's gone before. It means, first of all, a general election. If we can't have that, then, as I said before, we should not be ruling out other democratic options, and that includes potentially going back to the people, but not just a second referendum, because there's a big danger here, and I said this before, and I find it all the time when I talk to people who voted to leave. Yes, people are reconsidering certainly some aspects of whether an extreme Brexit is a good idea. They're concerned about developments, very concerned, many people. But when they hear the idea of having just a second referendum, for many people that just sounds like you didn't like the first result, like what happened in Ireland. And that must not happen, because we've got to avoid that polarisation. And actually, in the long run, I think that's even more of a risk, given the kind of polarisation we're seeing in other similar European countries and the rise of the far right. So that, I suppose, is where my party's coming from. If that's
that's great. So as I said, I'd want to invite a few kind of contributions or responses or challenges to that. So I recognise Graham Jones as the chair of the European movement in Oxford.
Yes, and very pleased on our behalf to be co-sponsoring this extraordinary and successful event. Thank you. Annalise, I'm delighted to hear you earlier say, and I think if I'm paraphrasing, but whatever we come out with, the 52% of the electorate need to feel that whatever we come out with is a win, as well as a 48%. Are you persuaded that in the event of another question to the electorate, are you persuaded that the option to remain should be on the ballot?
There's another question here. I'll take there's a sad one, I'll take the sad afterwards.
Hi, my name's Adrian Harper-Smith. I have to say I love and respect you dearly. You're a fantastic MP. I read the conference sites for the Labour conference, I listened to the debates and discussions afterwards. I understand what you're saying is currently Labour policy, but we have to recognise that we've had, 2 years, 3-4 months since the referendum. Time is really running out. We don't have time. Maybe we'll have a general election. We've got fixed term Parliament Act. That makes that very, very difficult in practice. I understand that if you have an election and you win that election, you want to give Keir Starmer a chance of negotiating a better deal. But can't we please recognise now that there is no deal that will mitigate the disaster that Brexit is going to bring, and the only option that's going to be the right one for our country is to remain. Please.
Thank you. I just wanted to make the point, Annalise, that nobody is talking about a second referendum. It's a referendum, a different referendum, on the terms of the deal. We're not talking about just repeating what happened 2 years ago. And people often quote Ireland when it comes to this, and how Ireland didn't vote the right way when the treaties were being drawn up, and so they had to vote again. Actually, the Irish government negotiated some changes and then people voted again. So this idea of second referendum, and people say, oh yes, well, we're just going to keep asking until you give the right answer. That's nonsense. And we shouldn't give in to that silly argument.
Thank you.
Oh, hi, Annalise. I just would like to reiterate what that chap said earlier. I mean, we've got Labour's idea that we're going to push for a meaningful vote, then push for an election, then other options, then a people's vote, but we're not too sure if there's going to be an option to remain on that. Okay, assuming you get a second election, what's the result? How is that going to help us in terms of Brexit? If Labour win, we still leave. If the Conservatives win, we still leave. If we get a hung parliament, we're stuffed. So should we not be pushing? Should Labour not be, you know, they seem to enjoy travelling hopefully, but never arriving. We know that this deal isn't going to pass your 6 tests. So should we not be saying, let's push for people's vote now and get on with it while we've still got the time?
So before you respond, I mean, there was a very, I think, revealing kind of first paragraph in Daniel Finkelstein's article in the Times a couple of days ago, where he poses a series of questions. He says, is there a majority in Parliament for leaving the EU without a deal? No. Is there a majority in Parliament for staying in the single market Norway fashion? No. Is there a majority for Theresa May's Chequers proposal? No. Is there a majority for a Canadian-style free trade agreement? No. Is there a majority for a general election? No. Is there currently a majority for a second referendum? No, there isn't a majority for anything. And I guess this is where we might find ourselves, given that this is the parliament we have, on the 29th of March. So how do we get out of this impasse?
Yeah. Well, I don't often agree with Daniel Finkelstein, but I think in some ways that list is quite helpful because actually, I mean, again, I'm drawing on my conversations that I've had particularly with Leave voters as well as Remain voters, and reflecting also on what people have said. And, you know, I obviously agree with a lot of that. There's a big question about how this is presented and there will be misinterpretations, etc. If it's clear the only way out of an impasse is to go back to the population, then there is much less capacity for the kind of backlash that could, I think, have that anti-democratic impact that I talked about earlier. If it can be interpreted in a different way, which it is being at the moment, unfortunately, for very unscrupulous reasons, but if it can be interpreted just as you didn't like the first result, which I accept is unfair, but if it can be interpreted as that, then it's much, much harder to close that down. And that's why I think, although it's convoluted and it's a long process, I think that's why it's the right process to take and why it would command much, much more democratic support, actually, genuinely. In relation to some of the other points that people have made, I think actually there's a lot more ambiguity and uncertainty around what any different vote question series would be formatted as. I say that because even with the initial referendum, right, many of us were very, very unhappy with how it was posed, right? So it should not have been Remain, it should have been Stay. That's what it was initially. It was changed because of pressure from the right, unfortunately. We had those questions changed. They caused a lot of confusion. It's the Electoral Commission, in theory, that's meant to be in control of this process. They would be in charge of a lot of how any future votes would go. Now, it's not clear to me whether they would say, oh, actually, you've got to have a 2-stage process, for example. You know, it's possible they might push for that. That could have potentially unintended consequences. And actually, just on one other potential design, I think it's quite important that we don't say that any such approach would be on the terms of the deal, because then that enables the right to say, okay, it'll just be between no deal and Theresa May's deal, actually. So I don't think it's exactly clear how it would be designed. But one thing is obvious to me, which is that we cannot let the right wing have the upper hand in this process again. They had it with the first, with the initial referendum. It cannot happen again. And then finally, thank you very much for your very, very kind comments. I mean, I campaigned to remain because I thought it was the right thing to do for this country. And I still think it would be best for our country to remain in the EU. I haven't changed my mind on that. I still think that that would be the right thing empirically. What, however, has changed is, I think, this polarisation that's occurred in the population between people who voted to leave and people who voted to remain. And somehow we've got to get over that polarisation. We've got to deal with that. And that relates to what we've just been talking about. If people think that they're being lectured at again by politicians, and in my experience, that's why a lot of people voted to leave, actually, because it's too associated, the Remain campaign, with a certain set of what was viewed as, fairly or unfairly, elite interests and elite individuals. If people think that they're being lectured at again, and people just didn't like the politicians didn't like the first result, then we could end up with potentially a vote that might go in the direction that many people here would want, but potentially huge numbers of people in our country who would feel even less connected to the political system than they do now. So I just think we've got to bear all of this in mind when we talk about these issues. We've got to talk within our own city. I mean, my part of the city, Rose Hill, voted to leave. Lots of our estates voted to leave, although overall the city voted to stay. What we can all do is to get out there and to talk to other people who have different views on this and try and come together somehow and get through this impasse. Thank you.
Thank you, Annalise. So I want to turn to the other panelists. If I can ask Liz first, and then I'll turn to Craig and talk to us about the Lib Dem position, as you were on this.
Well, the Lib Dem position is very, very straightforward. We want an exit from Brexit. Simple as that. No fudging, no beating around the bush, no standing there wringing our hands. Just let's be honest about what we need to do. Because who is going to suffer? I'll tell you exactly who's going to suffer most, and that is the very people that Annalise wants to protect. Those are the people who are going to suffer either way. I'm sorry, but we have to take this on by the horns, because if we don't, it won't happen. If we leave it up to our parliamentarians, what do we think is going to happen? Well, I can tell you now, listening to what Annalise says, nothing, absolutely nothing. We do not have an opposition willing to take on the government on this. We do not have a government that is willing to listen to the people. So the people have to get out there and say what they want, which is a people's vote. That's what we need. Now, it's all very easy to stand up here and say that. The truth is, of course, it's much more complex. What we've heard tonight, I think, from our panellists tells us just how complicated and complex this whole business is. We shouldn't be here, of course. It'd be nice if we wasn't, and I'm very sorry that my former MP saw fit to put us into this position in the first place. But we are where we are. But the fact remains that actually, unless we are willing to stand up and say what we believe is right, not what we think we ought to do just in case there might be a riot or two somewhere, but what is right for this country is what we have to focus on. And that is why we say an exit from Brexit is what we want. So that's as much as I really want to say. I just think it's time that we started to take this very seriously. It is serious. We have very little time left. We've got 176 days. The government seems completely incapable of telling us what's going to happen. We have absolutely no idea whether or not we're going to be having, well, I guess we'll have a transition period, but we don't know what that's going to look like. So it really is about time that we made our voices heard and got out there. We're going to talk about the People's March in a minute, but that's where the Liberal Democrats would like to see us.
Thank you. Thank you, Liz. If I could ask Craig then Steph, so Craig to talk about the Green Party's position and maybe segue into the City Council's involvement.
Sure. Yeah, I think the Green Party position is equally clear. We believe the only way forward is a people's vote, and a vote to be run under fairer terms, the terms that the original vote should have been run under, that the House of Lords wanted it to be run out, the Electoral Commission wanted it to be run over, but wasn't. It was run under rules which excluded large portions of the population, excluded the young, excluded those which were overseas, and it should have been a constitutional one that required a two-thirds majority. That was the only thing that made sense. And it's a shame Annalisa's gone, because I was going to say, isn't it strange how, you know, I feel old-fashioned, because how come you can sort of set policy with a general election? I mean, the old-fashioned way was you had a manifesto before an election where you told people what you were going to do and what your policies were. You didn't say, vote for us, and only then will we tell you what we're going to do. That's utterly crazy. I mean, if we did that on anything else, the whole country would be grind halt. We'd be laughing stock. Why aren't Labour Party laughing stock with their current policy? It's ridiculous. Well, no, there should be more of a laughing stock, perhaps. Anyway, now we talked about what's happening on the council, and I think, you know, we are, in a sense, disenfranchised as well as local councillors. We don't have the benefit. Annalise Dodds has access to Parliament as directly as she does, and we don't have access to political machinery as easily as she does. But what we can do is to try to provide a voice for the disenfranchised people in this city. There's a lot we can do and a lot we are doing. When I was chair of Finance Panel, I commissioned a report on Brexit, on the economic impact of Brexit, and that wasn't to make it more inevitable, but was to try to prevent it. And you'll be surprised, and even I was surprised at the huge impact it would have on the city. And I don't have time to go into detail, but those that want to can find the report on the council website. So what we can do is we can highlight the problems by doing things such as publishing reports. We can make a noise and keep up the pressure, and I think we've been quite effective as a council at doing that. We can suggest solutions. One of the things we suggested was to allow citizens of Oxford and elsewhere to retain their EU citizenship after Brexit, and we made that suggestion, started to give that idea some oxygen and some publicity, which has helped, and others have picked it up as a result. And we can keep the debate focused on staying in the EU, and I agree with what's been said before, that's really important. But what happens if all of that doesn't work? And that's what's got me thinking, and it will be a desperate situation, and desperate situations require desperate measures. And that what we can do as a local authority is limited. But the things I've been thinking of is we probably have to break the law. We probably have to withhold business rates and our taxes from central government. I think that's the only thing we can do. And we might well see all of us, you know, up before the dock as local councillors, but I think there's a fair few of us who are willing to go through that.
All right, thanks, Craig. Perhaps Stephanie Green, who's elected to the council a few months ago, representing Headington, could talk to us about the Lib Dems on the council and their position on or involvement in activities around Brexit.
Hi. I'm a little bit surprised to find myself here tonight, because in fact, actually, I've always seen myself as one, a nurse and been in the healthcare profession, and two, as a mother and a member of where I live in Headington. So I got involved after Brexit because I could see the impact on my family. We're an international family. We've got family in Germany, South Africa, as you can hear my accent, Australia, everywhere, and we've brought our kids up to be tolerant and internationalist. So I'm absolutely shocked that I'm sitting here in Oxford in this situation, and I think we are better than this. So I fully support the people's vote, but definitely with the option to remain in the European Union, because I do not respect the legitimacy of the referendum that was held in 2016. If you're going to have a vote for direct democracy, as we did then there's an onus to educate your voters, to have a plan and to consider the impact and the consequences of whatever that vote may be. Unfortunately, this was not the case in this instance. The referendum campaign was run on lies, misrepresentations, exaggerations, and sadly, a great lack of information and understanding of how the European Union works. Yes, it was an amazing turnout, you can't deny that, but it was still only 37% of the country. Should we really accept that those circumstances back then are enough for such a significant constitutional change to our country? The referendum was also not party political, and it should not be now. The decisions that are being made should be made what's best in the best interest of the country, not the party and not the leaders of those parties. We need to remember that the decisions made in Westminster should be in all our interest, and that they have a duty to serve us, but they also have to stand up for our rights. And now it's becoming clear that that we are not going to get any of the long list of promises that were made by the Brexit campaigners. We should, as a country, be given the opportunity to vote again. Vote with an understanding of what that is actually going to mean to us. And that is why I support the people's vote. Thank you.
So before we have kind of a final round of question and contributions from the floor, I want to ask Colin Golden, one of my Oxford Europe colleagues and pretty much the mastermind behind this particular evening, so much credit to Colin, to talk about what Oxford Europe is doing in respect of the People's Vote campaign, both locally and nationally, and also talk about the march that is forthcoming.
Thank you, Ruby. So these are just a few words on behalf of, not officially, but from the point of view of our organisation, which obviously has put on this event today and has done a few such things in the past and will hopefully do a few more things in the important time ahead of us. And it's a way it's wanted to segue into some thoughts about practical agendas, what is to be done in specific terms. What are we trying to do as a group in specific terms, and what do we need to think about in terms of how we're going to win? Just a quick word in response to our panellists, and it was actually quite moving to hear the power of what they had to say and the force of it, and that one is hearing things that haven't been said in public in the same way. It was one of our wishes in this meeting and in past ones to change, to move the window a bit in terms of what can be said, to give spaces to people to speak out who need to speak out, and they've certainly taken that opportunity today. We didn't, of course, ask them to make political statements. We asked them to speak as arts people, business people, research people, about how it is for them, what Brexit means for them in factual terms as a business. And they've obviously been politically quite eloquent while stating those bald facts to us, because they're very powerful facts. So that's been instructive and actually quite powerful, and I think that power is something that needs to be mobilised again and again with different constituencies. Clearly, the health sector came to speak for us previously. The research sector came to speak for us previously. We have to keep that effort to open up the spaces to give voice to people. Glad that we had the Oxford Mail and Times with us tonight. Glad we had the BBC interviewing people with us tonight. That's a sign that things are opening up a bit, maybe. Okay. I'm going to make a working assumption here, and this is really the assumption that we are working on as a group, and the other 150 groups like us that now exist up and down the country, which we liaise with. And that is that here in Oxford, and increasingly across more and more areas of the country, there is a growing majority in favour of the view that Parliament should and must allow the people to have the final word on any Brexit deal or any no-deal Brexit that our government may propose. And when we say a final word, we mean, of course, one which includes the right to say no to Brexit. Okay, that's the basic proposition, the basic working assumption. Now, those of us who take this view have got clearly to mount a very big push in the near future to ensure, firstly, we get this vote, and that includes Saturday, 2 weeks on Saturday, the 20th, to have 1 million people in London to demonstrate quite clearly to government that the people want to have their say. Besides the march, we've got to work and work and work on changing the minds of more of our MPs. You've heard that issue illustrated, and changing the minds of more of our fellow citizens. So everything we've been doing in that way for 2 years has got to be done more and more, again and again, and on a bigger scale and faster. But in addition to that, I think we've got to think about two other things that one would like to put on the table very quickly. It's not going to be enough to get a people's vote. We have to be in a position to win it when we get it. Okay, and that's not being discussed that much at the moment, and not enough possibly at the moment. Firstly, and that's something that has come up in conversations with tens of our fellow groups around the country, is the need to prepare the messages that you can win with. What are the messages that you need to use in a campaign to fight and to succeed? Just a few very quick thoughts on that, and then to another practical point where, if there's time, maybe the councillors can come back and comment. This time around, we're going to have to forget about all that Project Fear. You've got to be tough on Brexit, and you've got to be tough on the Brexiters, a hell of a lot tougher than one was. And goodness sake, we've got enough ammunition now to do that. Secondly, we've got to have the courage of our convictions and make the solid case for the EU as a good thing and a good idea, and for EU membership as something which is much better for us as a country to keep than to lose. We have to make that case too. Now, these things seem to be unnecessary, but they're not enough. And here comes the challenge, I think. No change is certainly better than disastrous change, but the public appetite for change has not gone away. If you offer a no-change option, as you did before, you still have a slight problem. So Andrew Adonis and Will Hutton, I believe, are right in their books, Saving Britain, to say that the case for continued EU membership needs to come with a positive offer for change in the UK, which must be offered as part of the Remain package. And we have to think about what that is going to consist of. That was something that some speakers, I think, rightly mentioned earlier. We have to explain this is a package you get on condition that we turn aside from the prospect of indefinite austerity and economic self-harm, which Brexit will inflict. If you want proper change, you don't do Brexit. But we have to also to be clear the package is going to be about squarely addressing the key evils, being tough on the causes of Brexit, the key evils that many people who voted leave were voting against, as people have said earlier: austerity, regional deprivation and decline, and ever more extreme inequality. The ills which they were told Brexit will cure, we know in reality it only aggravates. I'd like to suggest that building a basic consensus among pro-Remain forces about what that offer or that package should try to address is something very important for our coming discussions here, for example. And Will Hutton himself, I know, would have been very glad to have been with us today. We'd maybe better get him to join us soon so we can have that conversation. So that's one thing that we need to do some work on, not alone with our community nationally, but we have to work on it. The other one, I think, is a very big one, which is to build the campaigning capability which can take these messages to the country and win. And that, it means bringing, for a start, all the pro-European, pro-Remain groups that we have, which is not inconsiderable now, together with a coalition of the willing in the political parties and the trade unions, plus a vast range of other citizens groups, constituencies in civil society and local, last but not least, local government. And that's where I'd like really to turn the question back, if we have time, to our friends on the council and say, can we together begin to see a path from where we are now? I mean, we have a council which passed a vote, a very powerful vote, for the people's vote. Here in Oxford, with that advantage, can we see a path towards building a really strong, unified remaining campaigning capability in the Oxford area? And that's a question I put to both our friends, Craig and Steph.
Right. Before I turn to them, are there any short contributions or questions or comments on the, as you were, sensibility of different options in perhaps the vote that we all hope will happen? So people's vote, because we did hear already, different modalities, and those are obviously very, very significant. Or perhaps more generally about campaigning around this. So I see Susan's here. So
well, one of the first things that really, again, irritates me is that, quite rightly, people that voted to leave get very upset when people say
fairness, I don't meet that many people because of being in this area. But I asked them why, and one of them was a London taxi driver just before the referendum. And during there, he goes, so what about all this referendum stuff then? So I said, well, it's a no-brainer. So they said, oh, you're voting leave. So I said, no, I'm voting remain. It's a no-brainer. It's a no-brainer that we leave. Why did you say that? He said, well, you see it on all these taxis here, they all think the same. So what's your rationale for it? He said, well, we don't like the idea of people in Europe voting on things that affect our life. So I said to him, have you ever been to Cornwall? So he says, why? I said, well, people in Cornwall don't like people in London voting on things that affect them. And I think that that's one reason. The most bizarre reason that I've ever been given for why somebody voted Leave is because 26 people in the village haven't got a passport and it's the EU's fault. I don't know how you respond to that.
Right. Okay, maybe a last contribution, just next.
There's a dark side to this, which is that if we do end up leaving, the government is planning to invoke the Civil Contingencies Act. Now, Mr. Hitchens, has said that that is the best way to create a democracy, to create a dictatorship overnight in the UK, the Civil Contingencies Act. The problem we're going to have is you have to do it when we leave because disaster's going to hit, there's going to be no food in the shops, so everyone's going to riot. If we remain, we may have riots, we'll still have to invoke the Civil Contingencies Act. We might just as well remain and invoke the Civil Contingencies Act.
Right, so before I turn quickly to Craig and Steph, maybe Joe, whilst you're holding the microphone, maybe you can talk just briefly about the march itself and what Oxford for Europe is doing for the march, just before we turn.
Oxford for Europe, as last time, we have coaches going to the march and obviously returning as well. We've got, mostly they're linked from St Giles, another pick-up and Headington outside Brooks, and then one up at Sandhills opposite the Park and Ride. We have a number of tickets still available. They're £15 return for adults, £10 for students, and we love the kids to come with us so they can come free. We really do need to hear from you if you want to book your tickets now, because we need to know whether to add more coaches, if there's a lot of enthusiasm, or to take coaches away if there's not, because obviously we can't afford to pay for them. So that's what we're doing. We really hope that you join us.
Thank you, Joe. So Craig and Steph, if you could each speak very, very briefly, and then we'll have to bring it to a close. Thank you.
I'm obviously new to the council, so I'll leave sort of the technicalities of how and what we can do to Craig. What I will say is I've certainly experienced that there's cross-party support to just bring an end to all of this. I became involved and I've been very, very involved with Oxford for Brexit, and I will go on any march and speak to anyone that I have to stop this, and will continue to do so.
Okay, Craig, you've got the last word.
So yeah, I'll try and be brief. So we are a very international city. You know, about 20%, 1 in 5 people was born outside the UK of our city residents. We're the most international city in the country, and I think we need to use that as a foundation to make a stand. But what does that sort of stand look like? And that's difficult because we've already convinced, in a sense, the people in this city to vote Remain. We put a lot of effort in as a council to communicate that. We did a lot of political parties on the doorstep, going around talking to people. So I think what we have to do is harking back to an earlier point. What happens in Oxford makes news nationally and internationally. So we need to create some news in Oxford. And if that means the council doing something outrageous, we need to do something outrageous because the circumstances demand it. I mean, we talked, it's funny, there's loads of stories like this, but we were talking about having overhead cable cars in Oxford. You might have seen that. But we had, you know, it was a green idea that made it into the papers and the Guardian and all these other things. We had Russian newspapers coming over and film cameras filming us about it. So we need to do something similar around Brexit. Now, I don't know what that is. Maybe that's withholding business rates. Maybe it's something else. But if we do that, we can probably have the biggest impact of anything if we create news that makes it nationally and internationally. And we can use our international links. We're very well linked as a city internationally. We have many twin cities in Europe, and that's a good way of getting some of that news out.
Okay, thank you very much. This draws this evening to a close. What I want to say is first, linked to what Craig has just said, and also kind of the responses earlier to Liz's point about disseminating information. We want you to be active participants in this, and so we will disseminate the information from this event, so clips that will be created, and if you can circulate, tweet, send it to friends, post it on Facebook, do it so it reaches a wider audience. That has an impact beyond the local, on the national and international, and we hope that will convince at least some MPs to act more bravely. The other point I was asked to mention by Liz Price, who maybe who's just there, that there is the European movement. It has a business survey that it asks people to fill, and that feeds back to their MPs, I believe. So if you are interested in filling up that sort of survey, then do get in touch with Liz, and she'll provide you the relevant details. The last thing I want to mention is what I mentioned at the start, which is that I hope you agree that this event was useful, helpful, unusual in the current climate. And if you want more of these events, then please be generous when you leave. That would make it much more likely to happen. And the last thing I have to say is just thank all of our panelists in the main kind of business people, panelists, our elected representatives, my Oxford for Europe colleagues for putting this together. I hope you've learned something. I have certainly become much more depressed, which is probably a good thing. And thanks everyone for coming, and keep being active and go on the march on the 20th. Thank you.